Our speaker tonight is Alison Judd, and she has come over from the McKenzie Heritage Printery Museum in Queenston, Ontario, where she is the museum coordinator and resident printer. And Alison received her education. She took a liberal arts studies degree at Trent and then went on to OCA, where she majored in printmaking, or in papermaking and bookworks. While she was there, she received several awards for printmaking and relief and print awards. She has participated in several group exhibitions in the Belleville Gallery, printmaking exhibit in the 13th Annual Book Fair at the OCA in 1995, and others in 1994, Earth and Imprints, Art on King, and she has worked at OCA, is that right, in the printmaking department? Am I reading this right? Yeah. And also she has worked at Art on King as well. I'd like to have you welcome, please, Alison Judd from McKenzie Heritage Printery.
All right, thank you for coming. Tonight I'll be telling you a little bit about the McKenzie Heritage Printery, its history, how it came about, where we hope it's going, and what exactly we have inside its doors. What I'll start off with, though, is actually, I'll start with McKenzie, William Lyon McKenzie, because if I start with him, it will make sense as to why we have this marriage of McKenzie and a printing museum. So I'll start with William Lyon McKenzie. He was born in Scotland and immigrated to Canada in the 1820s at the age of 25. And he landed in Quebec, worked there for a while, and then made his way to Dundas. He considered himself a bookseller. He opened a store and a patent drug seller as well. He had quite a flourishing business, but he sold that and moved to Queenston in 1823, and this is where we come into play. He lived in Queenston for not even a year, but he started his publishing career there. He published his first newspaper called The Colonial Advocate, which came out in 1824. So he lived in Queenston for under a year. He started his newspaper in the May of 1824 and left Queenston in the November. So he actually only had 6 months of printing time. The Colonial Advocate is a weekly newspaper, so he almost got it out every week. He had other political engagements at the time, so there were a few missing issues. But what happened was he began printing this newspaper, but he didn't actually print from Queenston. What we found out is he didn't have a press, and he didn't have a paper supply, so he actually printed it in Lewiston, New York. So for the first 5 months of printing life of the Advocate in Queenston, it was actually printed in the States. He eventually managed to acquire a press, and it was only the last month that the paper was actually printed in the village of Queenston. So the life of the Colonial Advocate actually was then carried on to York. He left Queenston in 1824. York was the hub of politics at the time, and he left there, took his paper with him, and then of course he becomes a little more well-known as he worked his way into the rebellion of 1837. In his career, he did publish 6 newspapers. The Colonial Advocate is considered to be his most successful. The other 5 never really made it. So where the marriage happens, of course, is he printed from Queenston. So the museum itself tells the story of McKenzie, but as well what we try and do is tell the story of the history of letterpress printing, citing McKenzie, of course, as an example of the power of the printed word. We try then and cover the 500-odd years of letterpress printing as well. So the house itself, it has quite a colored history as well. We don't know when it was built. When McKenzie arrived, it seemed to have been there in 1823, and he moved in. And after 1824, there seems to be very little record of what happened. All we know is that by the 1920s, there's records of it being a ruin or a shell. I'll have a picture to show you of it. What happened then was in the 1930s, the Niagara Parks Commission owned the property and still owns it today. and they had the ruin, and they wrote a letter to the Prime Minister at the time, who was William Lyon Mackenzie King, his grandson of the Liberal Party. So I don't know how they would have seen each other, but they wrote a letter to Mackenzie King suggesting that this be made a historic site. Mackenzie King actually didn't want the house rebuilt. He suggested that they preserve the ruins, but the Niagara Parks Commission went ahead, and as a make-work project in 1936, they began rebuilding the house. It was completed by 1938, and there was a grand opening that Mackenzie King attended. The house was then considered to be a possibility of opening a printing museum. They had the intention of actually acquiring Mackenzie's press and having it as a Mackenzie home with a working printing press. That never actually happened. Whether it was because of the onset of the war, some people say it was because we had a royal visit at the time, or political parties changing, the museum never actually came to its fruition. The Niagara Parks Commission did manage to acquire what they believed to be Mackenzie's press, and they also acquired another press. We call it the Louis Roy Press. It's in the possession of the parks still today, and it's in the museum, and it's believed to be the oldest printing press in Canada. It's a wooden press, an original wooden press. We also have pictures of that. But it's funny that they managed to get this far. They redid the house, they acquired the press, and nothing happened. So the house then was turned into municipal offices. The Niagara-on-the-Lake had their offices there. It eventually became a private residence. The Niagara Parks Commission had their superintendents living in the house. And it wasn't until 1990 that it was open again for the public. In 1990, they had a show of the Kirby collection, local artifacts collected by the community. And they had that show for the summer. In 1991, then comes in the printing museum. Now, the people who put together the collection, we call them the Printery Committee. It's a group of volunteers, historians, printers, and people interested in the area. It was through their hard work that the collection was actually put together. The Niagara Parks Commission still owns the building and actually runs the building, and is this year has taken on much more of the responsibility of actually the administration. So it's really a joint venture now. The Printery Committee is a very active committee, very active board. We have many of the printers who still come in, and many, you might know their names. Bill Poole is involved, and people like that, and they come in and they actually still use the facilities and help with putting together the exhibits and things like that. So the museum is now in its, just coming into the end of its 6th season, and we've, especially this year with the Niagara Parks taking on more of the administrative work, we really have sort of made a jump ahead. So I'm very excited about what's to come. But what I'll do now is actually turn on the slide projector, and I'll take you, I have pictures of some of the collection, and I'll take you through the museum and explain a little bit more. This is the house. It's situated in the village of Queenston, and you probably can't see it, but in behind us, we're right in the shadow of Brock's Monument. It's a wonderful village. It's located right in between Niagara-on-the-Lake and Niagara Falls, and it's just off the Niagara Parkway. So we're still very accessible from the Parkway, and yet, let's see if I can get that in focus, and yet we're not nearly as hectic as I don't know if anybody has been to Niagara Falls lately, but we're not nearly as hectic as that. We're still quite quiet, which is very enjoyable in the summer months. So that's the front view. The 2 trees that you see on either side of the door were believed to have actually been planted by Mackenzie. When he published his Colonial Advocate, he celebrated by planting 5 acacia tree seeds, or locust, honey locusts. And these are believed to be 2 of the remaining 5. He did mention in some of his later papers that he'd gone back to Queenston and visited the old homestead, and mentions then that he saw his acacia trees thriving. So when Mackenzie King came down in the 30s to open the building, in his speech he referred to them as trees being planted from seeds of reform. So we're pleased that they're still here. They're both in wonderful shape, and remind us of how long it's been. So there's our close-up. Yeah, the Parks Commission is responsible for all the maintenance of the building. These pictures are actually taken right after our paint job, so it's looking wonderful, and they tend all the grounds in the area, so we have nothing to worry about there. This is actually a picture of the house taken in about 1932, we believe. As you can see, the two trees are still there on either side of the door, and this roadway coming up here is actually the Portage Road, which is the main road from Niagara-on-the-Lake up around the falls that was taken for all the portage routes. So that is why the house is actually situated sideways to the road now, because the road used to come up in the front of it. The road that's existing now is actually the old train tracks that used to run. They used to have a trolley car that would go up the escarpment and into Niagara Falls. So people often ask us if it was burned because there's no roof, but people have mentioned that people who lived in the area prior to this have said that there used to be a roof and it just fell in. So we really have no other information as to what happened. We say it was restored. I suppose we should say it was completely rebuilt. They did use stones from the same quarry that they believe that these stones were from. So that's the man himself. He keeps a watchful eye on the place. That's who I see first thing every morning. Yes, it's a wax figure we have donated from Tussaud's Wax Museum in Niagara Falls, and he gives many people a scare. It's actually rather ironic because Mackenzie, in his early 20s, lost all of his hair in a fever, so he actually took to wearing red wigs. This is not a wig. This is implanted, so it doesn't come off. But he was known, when he got himself all agitated and worked up during political speeches, he was known to actually take off the wig and throw it to make the point. So I don't know if we would have gotten along. Okay, so there he is, keeping an eye on the place. This is the Louis Roy press. The way the museum is set up is we have mainly three different areas. The front room here holds the majority of the presses. We have a back room called the composing room where we have all of our typesetting equipment. And then upstairs we have gallery space, a library that's just beginning, and then a meeting room. So this is our Louis Roy press. It's really the prize of the collection. And it's dated from probably about 1760. It would have been manufactured in England and brought to Canada. Believed to have spent some of its life in Quebec, probably having something to do with the Quebec Gazette, but was brought to Niagara-on-the-Lake, or it was called Newark at the time, which was the capital, by John Grave Simcoe to print Upper Canada's first newspaper in 1793. So I have a copy of the reproduction of the paper here. It was called the Upper Canada Gazette and American Oracle, and the first paper came out on April 18th in 1793. This press is a wonderful example for us to show people. This is where we start when we're trying to explain the actual history of letterpress printing. What you see on the, I don't know how familiar you all are with the advances in technology, so I'll fill your ears with a bit of that as well. The two, they look like mallets almost. In the front of the picture are actually ink balls. And they were used to apply ink to the type prior to rollers. Rollers were actually a technology that didn't come into the 1800s. So that was how they actually applied ink to the type. This press is about, what do we say, 1760, 300 years after Gutenberg, and it's still basically the same. They've replaced the wooden corkscrew with a metal, an iron corkscrew, steel corkscrew, sorry. But it's still basically the same layout. This is a close-up of the workings. It's a fixed platen. You can't adjust that in any way. And so what they do in order to adjust their printing would be to actually move the stone that the type is set on. It was called a coffin, and some people say they used to put gravestones in there, but I don't know about that. And it was actually generally filled with either sawdust or sand so that they would shimmy the stone in order to try and get their even printing, because the platen is fixed. So there's another angle. So this is, there's McKenzie. Look at his eyes. My. This is our Albion. This is our main demonstration press. And we keep it in good working order mainly for school tours. The children have a wonderful time in the museum because we have many things they can get their hands on. We put them to work, and they really get a sense of what typesetting's all about. So this is it's a Hopkinson & Cope Albion from 1863, and it is used pretty much every day. So this press, the cast iron, this is also a flatbed press, very similar to the Louis Roy, and the first cast iron press came in 1800. So that's a full almost 400 years after Gutenberg, and they were still using flatbed presses as well. This is our newest acquisition. It's Chandler & Price. It's from about 1930, and it has a Kluge automatic paper feeder attached that is almost in working order. All the pieces are there. We just have to get the timing right so we don't take off somebody's hand. But the automatic paper feeder is actually worked on air suction. There's a pump that was attached to where the foot pedal, the treadle area was, and it would feed the paper automatically by air suction. This one is belt driven you can't see it, it's on the right, and with an electric motor. It also has its ink fountain at the top there for the platen. So one of the things I probably neglected to mention was thank goodness they had the idea of making this a printing museum when they restored the house, because they managed to put in reinforced concrete floors under all this wood. So we don't have to worry about the weight of all the equipment. This is our Westman & Baker platen press, and it's actually run by a little motor down here. It's from 1914. It's a friction motor, so the wheel just sits on the axle there, and it goes. We always know when we get electricians in to see the museum, because that's the first thing they go look at. They spy that out and go straight for the motor. So it's the pedal in the front of the wheel is what actually activates it. That's the press that we do most of our printing on. I guess it's our high-speed production press. And yeah. Okay. So this is our back room. This is the composing room. When these pictures were taken, we had just had a very large school tour. So you can see type cases out, probably where they shouldn't be. We had people setting type. So the composing room holds our hot type and cold type, and this is where we do most of the work. There's a portrait of McKenzie again over the fireplace in this back room. That's another angle. The pictures on the walls are actually all from the St. Catherine's Standard. They were also a great help in the beginning. They probably supplied most of the finances for actually moving the first lot of equipment into the museum. It's been too bad that the St. Catherine's Standard, of course, was swallowed up by Southern. It's now being printed in Hamilton. So we've lost that element of the community. So one of our type cases. So we have, in the museum, we have quite a large selection of type. It's in varying states of condition because most of it's donated. Some of it is quite new. We had a whole I suppose 3 cabinets come from the CBC, actually, when they used to use their type to do their headline stamping for their film work. So we have a whole whack of that, but then we also have a large selection of worn type and used type. We have, that's probably where we're the most behind, is sorting the type. It's a tremendous job when you get a cabinet full of type that you have to go through and try and decide if it's usable or not, and what should be kept and what should be gone for melting. So this is our Ludlow and Ludlow cabinet. This was used, this machine came in about 1911 and was used for the headlines in the newspapers. Forgive me, this is hot type technology, and I don't know if anybody, how much people know about the technology, but the hot type technology came in 1885 with the invention of the linotype, and it's a typecasting mechanism that replaced all of the handset type. So there was about 450 years of setting type by hand, and then hot type came in and eventually took over. So this is a Ludlow, and was really only used for the display type and for the larger headlines. It's still a handset method. What I'm doing there is actually filling a composing stick with brass molds, matrices of letters, and the machine injects molten lead into those molds and creates a slug or a line of type, very similar to the linotype machine. It's just much larger fonts. That's the locking mechanism. Our machine is about 1930. We have a second one downstairs that's from about 1950. So this is our linotype machine, and this is our most recent acquisition. It came in the summer, and it was very exciting. It was donated by Peninsula Press in St. Catharines. And what we had to do, I must admit, we had to reinforce the floor under this one. It weighs about 3,500 pounds. It was lifted in by crane because the road is actually comes in underneath, lower than the museum. They had to lift it from the truck on the street up over the roof of the museum to get it in the back doors. We were under construction for probably a month this summer, right at the height of the season. I won't say any more. You can see behind me there's a door. It used to be a single door there. It's now a set of double doors. And when the stonemasons came, they had to remove all the stone, make it larger. They had figured that it would be half stone, half mortar. Well, it was completely stone. It's this thick, and it took them twice as long to get through it than expected. We do have the double doors though now, which makes moving equipment in and out much easier. So the linotype came in by crane and rolled into this position here. It is in working order. We do use it. It was in working order when it came, but it needed a lot of cleaning. It was sitting in they're always in basements, sitting in the basement of Peninsula Press and covered in offset dust. So we had a local man come in and work on it for about 2 weeks, and he had been the linotype machinist for the St. Catharines Standard for 20 years. And he came in after not working on the machines for 20 years and put it up to scratch. So he was wonderful to have around. He was fabulous to talk to people. People would ask him questions, and it's amazing. He knows the machine absolutely inside out. So I'll do a quick rundown of actually how the linotype machine works. I don't know if you're familiar with it. This is its keyboard. It bears no resemblance to a typewriter keyboard. I don't know why. It might have something to do with the order in which the matrices have to drop when you're typing. So what happens is the compositor sits at the keyboard and types in the sentence of his column for the newspaper. The machine then releases brass molds, individual brass molds for each letter. So as they type their letter on the keyboard, the brass mold is released from the machine, and they actually compose the the sentence with the brass molds. The molds are then moved into another part of the machine where they're injected with molten lead, and then the slug is produced. We have a slug. There's the slug. So that's what the machine produces. It takes literally seconds for the slug to be produced, and then the brass molds are carried to the top of the machine where they run along a keyed channel with a distribution, I've forgotten the word, cylinder, anyway, spiral, rotating spiral. Anyway, they are put back from where they came. They all drop off at the exact point and drop right back into their channels to be used immediately again. So this is the machine that caused the revolution in the typesetting industry. It put a tremendous amount of people out of work, and allowed daily newspapers to really happen. Prior to 1885, a daily newspaper was very hard to produce. You had to have dozens of compositors, and this allowed the dailies to happen. So this machine, the linotype, was then used from 1885 right into the 1970s. If you go out west, they were used into the 80s. And of course, there are still operating machines today, but it was the workhorse for about 80 years. This is an example of a locked up page. This is from the St. Catherine Standard. It's the last sports page they ever did, and it's from 1976. I love to see the reactions from people when you tell them that. We tend to think that the computers have been here forever, but this is what it produces. So you can see the larger headlines would be what the Ludlow would produce, and then the linotype creates the page. So there it is. This is where we show people where you go from the linotype, the lockup page, through to being press ready. So this is a display utilizing pictures from the St. Catherine Standard, where we explain how they go from the flat page to these. You can see the cylinder on the right for press ready work. It's the yellow, you can't really see, the yellow and the gray are actually thick paper mats called flongs. Now, some people say they were called flongs because they were flung away once they were used. But we get a tremendous amount of tales and stories from printers who come in and fill your ears with their 25 years of industry. And so all those interesting bits of language that never actually get into dictionaries, all those colloquialisms and slang words you get to hear. So that's our flong. So that the mat is then, it's laid down on that, on the linotype page, on that lock up, run through a heavy press so that you get the exact positive of what the linotype has produced. It's then put into a cylindrical mold where it's injected with the lead, and you end up with the cylinder that is actually printed from and goes on the press. If it was a large newspaper, you'd have to make 2 or 3 for each page because, of course, the lead wears. And then at the end of the day, all of that is melted down to be used again. So not much waste. So there's a close-up of our cylinder. What we do as well with all the other space, you might have noticed that the walls were all covered with comic strips. Every year we try and have an added show that has something to do with printing. We try and utilize as well Canadian content. So this year we had the 100 Years of Comics. It was the 100th anniversary of the first color comic strip in the newspapers. Last year we had an exhibit on circus posters. We had posters up from Conklin shows from this area, and then as well we had work from Andrew King and King Show Prints. It's a very interesting story about a printer from Rouleau, Saskatchewan, who the train literally rolled into town one day with the circus, and the circus posters hadn't arrived for the circus, and the circus owners went to the local printer and said, "We need promotion, we need our posters." And so he set to he'd never done it before, and started carving wood blocks for the circus posters. At this point, they were using 3-color wood block printing, and he ended up being the major poster printer in Canada. So it's a fabulous story. So that was last year. The year before that, we had a show on Carl Dare, who's a very little-known Canadian typographer and type designer, and he was from Welland, and so we had a show on him as well. So we try and every year have a new exhibit. This year, the 100 Years of Comics was very popular with every generation, but the interesting thing was which generations migrated to which part of the exhibit. These are our original tear sheets from the newspaper, dating from Buster Brown was 1904, and then I believe we went into the 1960s. When these came in, I have to admit, these came in from a private collector in the United States. I think we read every single one, and we found out that probably 70% of them weren't funny at all to us. It's an amazing record of how humor changes, but the changes in the time. There are so many politically incorrect things in here, I couldn't believe it. That the kids didn't like us at all. Children took one look at it and left. Pretty much, it was the adults that found great joy in this. I believe the Cats and Jammer Kids was probably our most popular. Many people remembered that. So these are original tear sheets from a private American collector, and they still grace the walls, and they'll be up. The show runs till the end of October. So I should backtrack a little. The first comic strip was actually called The Yellow Kid, and it ran in, I'm going to get them mixed up, the New York Journal. We'll go with the New York Journal. And it came out in 1896. What you can see on the very right of this is actually a poster blow-up of one of the Yellow Kids. And the story goes that the term yellow journalism was actually coined because of the sordid history of the Yellow Kid. The artist that produced this worked for one of the New York papers, and I'm going to get them mixed up, so I won't even name them. And it became tremendously popular. The Sunday, it was a way to convince people to read Sunday newspapers, and it worked. What happened was the rivaling newspaper tempted him over with more money, offers of more money, and he went, and he drew the Yellow Kid for them. Well, the previous offered him more money, and he went back, and there was this battle for dollars over this comic strip, and eventually they coined the term yellow journalism because it became so nasty, and people read the papers for the Yellow Kid. So that's one of the stories behind that. This is the second half of this display that shows how comics are printed today. This was actually put together by American Color and Sullivan Graphics in Stevensville, and it's a very highly reduced show that ran in Boca Raton, Florida. They have a huge comic museum down there. So this was scaled down for our size of walls, and it shows how they're printed today using flexography and the 4-color process, and of course computer scanning and computer coloring and lots of computers. So this is what the kids like. So there you go. Upstairs, our gallery upstairs is actually called the Carl Dare Gallery. We named it after Carl Dare. And we used this space this year for original artwork from a comic strip called Rural Route. And it was done by Walter Ball, and it ran in the Toronto Daily Star from the 50s into the 60s. He was actually from Cookstown, so it's a nice, it's very nice to have, since a lot of the comics downstairs are actually from American papers. So this is our local boy. This is an example of one of the posters that came in from King Show Prints for last year's show, and this is a 3-color woodblock print. What this is examples of some of the things we have at the museum to sell. We call ourselves an operating printing museum, and that's what the ambition is to be, is actually use all of this equipment and be able to show people what it can produce and keep the presses rolling. So we do produce small things that we can sell. Along the right is their pica, which is actually our newsletter. Ironically enough, the first 3 issues were done on computers and printed in the modern way. And the last 4 or 5 and the upcoming one are actually we've gone back to handset and hand printed and hand bound. Bill Poole, John Hunt, and Bob Halls are responsible for that, and they do a marvelous job. They're trying to concentrate on having actually wood engravings on the front cover. So there's a Gerard Brander Brandis, and then I believe we're using one of Wesley Bates's cuts for the cover this time. So it's the printed material is it's going to be interesting. It's hard to keep up. We have such a short operating season. Our season is actually from May. We opened May 18th and we closed on Labor Day. We have a shoulder season on either end. Beginning of May to June we do school tours, and then I'm there till the end of October and we continue with the school tours. So it's a short season. What we also do, we've started this year, and I hope it expands, is we do a certain amount of printing jobs for other sites and other locations. What we've concentrated on this year is actually doing it for the historic sites in the park. We have done work for other historic sites, and it's a wonderful bonus for them to actually have something that's done of the period. So this is something we set for Fort Erie. They had a siege weekend, and we printed posters that they could post and then sell. And this was this is a poster from our very first Book Arts Fair this year. We took the plunge and held a small Book Arts Fair down at the museum. We rented a big top tent, set it up on the common ground that's across the street, and had a number of exhibitors come down. We had fabulous weather. We were very lucky. And good turnout from the participants, and we seemed to get the village and the local people involved. So I was pleased with the way it worked, and I hope that it's the first of many. So, and I believe, it stopped working. Well, there we go. I believe that's the end anyway. Look at that. Oh well. So that's the end of the slides. The museum has a tremendous amount of potential. We're still young, and we have many programs and things that I can see that we can develop in order to, I hope, make this a working print shop, and also a very important part about preserving the history of letterpress printing. Right now, because of it's an interesting thing for me to be there, because my background is art school, and fine art printing. The people who started the museum are much more industry-based. We have a lot of newspaper people, and of course that's where it's come from. So it's an interesting mix to have me there, because I look at it, of course, from an artist's perspective. I look at it from all my colleagues who print their own handmade books, and of course I see that as the community that's going to keep it alive. So I'm excited about the future of the museum, and that's probably all I have to say. So if anybody has any questions, I'll try and field them. I have up here, I've just learned something fascinating. We have an example of Mackenzie's first newspaper, the Colonial Advocate. This is obviously not the whole thing. We sell this at the museum, and I've just seen one of the originals, and it seems to be missing a number of pages, so I'll have to look into that. It's good reading, though. And then as well, we have I have some of the back issues of our newsletter, and you're welcome to them. We've only got a few of 4, and this is yours. So I guess number 5 is not up for grabs. But yes, so if anybody has any questions. Yeah.
This is Mackenzie's press. You had one of his presses.
What happened, the press,
Picture there?
no.
We don't. What happened with that press actually was the parks acquired it, and when the museum never came to light, they actually gave it to McKenzie House in Toronto. So it's the press in McKenzie House in Toronto is actually on permanent loan from the Niagara Parks Commission too. So that's the press that they believe was his. So.
For the 6 months, I mean, is it?
That's, originally they
Began that way because that's what they thought their operating season was going to be. The Niagara Parks Commission considers that the operating season. So we have to convince them it has to be longer. It's really just the Niagara Parks. That's the tourist season, and we are in a tourist area. So.
But if you want to use it to print, would you keep that part aspect of it open throughout the year? I mean, it would be isn't it difficult to run a print
yes,
place for just 6 months?
yes.
Difficult and very difficult to get anything done. Yes, we have to. That's something in the future is extending its season, and I would hope inviting, having resident artists down to continue that. As well, there are other facilities in the area. There's the Niagara Pump House, which is the artist center down in Niagara-on-the-Lake, and I see the potential of running workshops in conjunction with that. So, but yes, extending the season is the next.
We write letters to the Niagara
Yes.
Parks Commission saying, this is a fabulous facility. It needs to be there longer. Do you want to hear this kind of thing?
Yes. Yes.
You're going to hand out the address for the Niagara
Yes.
Parks Commission?
We'll do that. I do have it. It's on this, and I don't mean to be, it's on a membership form. But I brought it for the address, so there you go.